The cold wind scraped across the shattered landscape like a blade, whispering through burned trees and torn metal. For weeks, the stretch of broken earth between the opposing trenches had been a graveyard of silence. No movements, no patrols, only distant artillery thumps echoing through the night. Soldiers on both sides knew the place simply as no man's land, a wasteland where the living rarely walked, and those who fell rarely returned. But beneath a collapsed wall of concrete and twisted rebar, a man was still alive. His name was Danilo, a Ukrainian reconnaissance scout, only 26. He had been sent with his team to observe enemy movement near a destroyed industrial outpost. It was supposed to be a quick infiltration, in and out before dawn. But war has a way of turning simple missions into nightmares. A drone spotted them as they crossed a shallow trench, and moments later, the world exploded around them. When the smoke cleared, Danilo didn't know how far he had been thrown, only that his left leg was pinned under concrete, his radio was shattered, and his team was gone. The first day was a blur of pain and dust. He tried calling out, but the distant roar of engines and shell impacts swallowed his voice. As night fell, temperatures dropped, and the only warmth he had came from the small fire he managed to start with torn cloth and a broken lighter. He rationed what little water he carried, sipping only enough to wet his cracked lips. Every time he tried to move the slab, crushing his leg, pain shot through him like molten steel, but he didn't give up. He couldn't. He repeated to himself over and over that someone, anyone, would come looking. But war lines move like tides, fronts shift. What was once safe becomes a kill zone, and the place where Danilo's team vanished had rapidly turned into a dead corridor, swept constantly by snipers and drones. No rescue team dared approach. Days passed, then weeks. The second week was the hardest. Hunger hollowed him out, leaving him lightheaded and delirious. He kept hearing footsteps that were never there, voices whispering his name in the wind. He learned to sleep in minutes, waking to the buzz of distant quadcopters scanning the ground. Each buzz sent fresh terror into his chest. Was it Ukrainian, Russian? Would it drop a grenade? Would it mark him for artillery? He pressed himself into the earth, praying the shadows that covered him would be enough. On the 15th day, a stray dog wandered near the rubble, sniffing cautiously. Its ribs showed through its fur, and one ear was torn. Danilo whispered softly to it, offering small crumbs of stale bread from his pocket. The dog approached slowly, then retreated, then approached again. For 2 days it stayed near him, keeping him company, sleeping curled at his side when temperatures fell below zero. On the morning of the 18th day, the dog disappeared, and Danilo knew why. A shell had landed somewhere nearby, scattering everything living in the area. The loneliness that followed hit him harder than the cold. By the 3rd week, he no longer remembered how many days had passed. The sun rose and fell, but he stopped tracking time. He spoke to himself just to hear a human voice. At one point, he began hallucinating that his mother was calling him home for dinner, and he smiled as he drifted in and out of consciousness. He didn't know that, back at his unit, the pilots of a volunteer evacuation group had just received a vague report, an intercepted message suggesting that a wounded soldier might still be alive somewhere near the old industrial zone. The group was unofficial, mostly civilian volunteers operating armored evacuation buggies built from scrap metal, salvaged parts, and whatever donations they could gather. Among them was the vehicle known as the Coffin on wheels. Black, rectangular, and heavily armored, it looked like something welded together in a garage, which it was, but appearances were deceiving. Its layered steel plates could stop small arms fire, and its reinforced underbelly could handle shrapnel impacts that would tear ordinary jeeps apart. Journalists who had seen it in action nicknamed it the Coffin on wheels, partly as a joke about its shape, partly because it had rescued so many men from places no one else dared reach. Its driver and commander, a former mechanic named Olksy, took pride in that name. To him, it symbolized defiance, the idea that even in the worst hellscapes of war, something built by human hands could defy death itself. When the call came in about a possible survivor, he didn't hesitate. He gathered his 2 crew members, checked the fuel reserves, and started up the roaring engine. The vehicle rolled out just before dusk, its headlights dimmed, its radio silent. The journey toward the industrial zone was slow and methodical. They avoided main roads, crawling along destroyed factory walls and fields scarred by artillery. Every few minutes they stopped to listen for drones. The sky was cloudy, giving them some cover, but the risk remained high. As they approached no man's land, they killed the engine and switched to a silent electric mode, barely audible above the wind. Without lights, Olksy navigated by memory and instinct. Inside his crumbling shelter, Danilo didn't hear the vehicle at first. What he heard instead was a faint crunching. Boots, wheels, he froze, tightening his grip on a rusted metal rod he had kept as a makeshift weapon. Seconds stretched. Then he saw a dim flicker of red light sweeping across the ruins. Someone was searching. Olksy and his team moved carefully between the debris, scanning each shadow. They used thermal cameras, but the intense damage and twisted metal scattered heat signatures, making it difficult to spot a human body. They were about to turn back when Olksy noticed something. Just a flicker, a faint warmth, half buried under concrete. There, he whispered. They approached cautiously. As they cleared debris, a human hand appeared, pale, trembling, and unbelievably still alive. When they uncovered his face, Danilo blinked against the sudden light. His voice came out as a croak. Ukrainian. Yes. Olksy whispered back, "We've got you. You're going home." Danilo broke into tears. Weeks of fear, pain, and isolation flooded out of him all at once. The crew immediately checked his wounds. Severe dehydration, hypothermia, possible infection, and a crushed leg that might need amputation. But he was alive, and that, to them, meant the mission had already succeeded. The extraction was dangerous. They had to lift the concrete slab without triggering the unstable ruins around them. Twice, fragments crashed down, forcing them to reposition. Danilo cried out in pain as they freed his leg, but Olksy placed a firm hand on his shoulder, telling him to hold on, to breathe, to stay conscious. Every second mattered. Every sound in the distance reminded them the enemy could spot them at any moment. Finally, they strapped him onto a stretcher and carried him to the coffin on wheels. The vehicle's interior was cramped, lit only by a single red bulb. They loaded him inside, secured him, and began the return journey. The first 10 minutes were quiet, too quiet. Then the whine of a drone pierced the air. Olksy cursed, accelerating. The drone circled overhead, searching. A spotlight flicked on for a brief second. A machine gun rattled not far behind them. The coffin's armor clanged as bullets struck its side, showering sparks. Danilo screamed as the vehicle bounced violently over uneven terrain, every jolt sending pain through his body. "Hold on," Olksy shouted. "We're almost out." A shell exploded behind them, throwing dirt and smoke over the vehicle. The force rocked them sideways, almost tipping them over, but the coffin held. Its reinforced suspension absorbed the shock, and Olksy kept pushing, weaving between obstacles, using every mound of dirt as cover. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they crossed back into Ukrainian controlled territory. The drone retreated, the gunfire faded. Olksy slowed to a halt and collapsed back in his seat, breathing heavily. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the overwhelming relief of having cheated death yet again. Medics rushed forward as soon as they saw the vehicle. They pulled Danilo out, checking his pulse, administering fluids, wrapping his leg. As they lifted him into the ambulance, Danilo looked back at the coffin on wheels, its armor scarred, dented, blackened. To him, it was the most beautiful machine he had ever seen. In the hospital, doctors fought hours to stabilize him. Infection threatened his life, and his leg was so badly damaged that amputation was considered. But he survived. He woke 3 days later, sunlight filtering through a cracked window, the faint sound of nurses bustling in the hall. The first face he saw was his commander, who had come personally to see him. "You made it," the commander said softly. Danilo nodded, tears welling again. "I thought I would die out there, but you didn't, because someone refused to give up on you." Over the next week, volunteers visited him, bringing warm clothes, food, messages from units across the front. When Oleksiy himself walked into the room, Danilo tried to sit up, but the older man waved him back down. "You scared the hell out of us," Oleksiy said with a grin. "You came," Danilo whispered. "We always come." Danilo reached out and gripped Oleksiy's hand. No words were exchanged. They didn't need any. News of his rescue spread quickly. Journalists called it a miracle. Some published photos of the coffin on wheels, praising the volunteers who risked everything to save one wounded soldier stuck in the deadliest strip of land in the war. But for the crew, it wasn't about fame or stories. It was about humanity, about the belief that no man should die alone in the dirt if there was even a single chance to bring him home alive. Weeks later, when Danilo was finally able to sit in a wheelchair, he asked to see the coffin again. Oleksiy brought him to the workshop where the vehicle was being repaired. Fresh plates were being welded on. Broken parts were being replaced. The scars from the rescue were still visible. "She saved me," Danilo said quietly. Oleksiy shook his head. "We saved you. Machines are just metal. People make them matter." Danilo smiled, "Then thank you." As the months went on, he slowly recovered. His leg, miraculously, didn't need to be amputated. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his life, but he would walk. And when he finally returned to his unit's base, his comrades greeted him with cheers and embraces. They had long believed him dead. Seeing him alive felt like witnessing a ghost walk through the door, but the war continued, and the coffin on wheels continued its work, rescuing the wounded, retrieving the fallen, rolling into zones that maps marked as death traps. Every mission carried the same risk, the same uncertainty, the same thin line between survival and tragedy. Yet Oleksiy never stopped. His crew never hesitated. They knew that as long as there were men like Danilo out there, clinging to life somewhere in the ruins, they had a duty to try. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon and smoke drifted across the sky, Oleksiy received another call, another soldier, another possible survivor, another journey into the darkness. He gathered his team, checked the engine, and looked at the photo taped to the dashboard. A picture of Danilo smiling weakly from his hospital bed. "Let's go," he said. The coffin on wheels roared to life once more, heading back toward the front, back toward danger, back toward the shattered line between life and death. Because in a war defined by destruction, it had become a symbol of hope, rusted, battered, imperfect, but unstoppable. And somewhere, far behind the lines, Danilo closed his eyes and prayed for the men who had brought him home, and for all the wounded still waiting in silence, hoping for the sound of a familiar engine breaking through the ruins, promising life where death once ruled. Because in no man's land, sometimes all it takes to save a life is a miracle made of steel, courage, and the unbreakable belief that no one should be left behind.